I think by far the most elusive trait of a good song is catchiness. Now, we often think that catchiness is an evanescent gift bestowed by the divine muses, and while there certainly exist such brilliant composers as Gershwin, Tchaikovsky, or Bernstein, whose best tunes have a special spark to them, the real reason catchy tunes in general are so catchy is largely due to the fact that the vast majority of them follow one of a few common musical structures that facilitate the balance of unity and variety. Today, I'd like to investigate these musical structures so we can find out just what it is about these mystical songs that makes them so darn catchy. Now, the key here is that balance. You don't want a tune to have too much exact repetition in it because then it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. On the other hand, too little repetition leaves the listener with nothing recognizable to grasp onto. It is on the fine line of balancing order and chaos that the great tunesmiths occupy and have mastered. So let's quickly define our terms. What even is catchiness? Well, I'm defining catchiness as a tune's propensity to be remembered, recognized, and dictated in the long and short term by the non-musician. One of the finest examples of this is Somewhere Over the Rainbow, a song that can be hummed by people all over the world. This includes plenty of children who may have never even seen the film it's from. And if a child with a completely untrained musical ear can listen to a melody and remember it well enough to dictate it back with reasonable precision, I think that's pretty catchy. To me, Somewhere Over the Rainbow is one of the gold standards of catchy melody. But how can we use this in our own tunesmithing? Well, as Aaron Copland advised us, we can examine many existing tunes we all agree to be catchy and examine the patterns that arise in commonality. The first commonality of many, many melodies is that they use two musical structures. These are sentence structure and periodic structure. Often both are used simultaneously in the same tune at different levels. Both of these musical structures employ the idea of antecedent and consequent phrases, which for simplicity's sake from now on I'm going to refer to as question and answer phrases respectively. So, how are these two types of phrases any different? Well, what constitutes a question as opposed to an answer is primarily a psychological consideration that's somewhat like actual verbal questions and answers, such as the phonological idea of raising pitch at the end of a sentence to indicate inquisition, and vice versa for the answer. But in music, these ideas can also be implied a ton of ways through use of metric placement or harmonically by tonic and dominant and all of its non-tonal counterparts. We'll get to these later. The important thing to note here is that the polarity is relative, unlike language, where everyone speaking the same dialect agrees that a written question mark or inflective rise in pitch at the end of a sentence unambiguously infers inquisition, meaning a musical answer merely has to sound more conclusive than what is perceived to be the question. Think of it like this. Compared to a cave, an overcast sky is bright, whereas an overcast day seems dark compared to a sunny day. Here's a little chart outlining some of the essential elements of musical composition that make something sound conclusive and inconclusive, or question and answer. In addition, I've written some tunes to illustrate each element. Each tune has two identical phrases, the second always an answer to the question posed by the first. Firstly, weak beats tend to sound less conclusive than strong beats. In this melody, the question phrase ends on beat 2, whereas the answer phrase finishes on the downbeat. Note duration can also have an effect on conclusiveness. Here, the question phrase ends on an eighth note, whereas the answer concludes on a more substantial half note. Next, relative range answer phrases often reach a higher point than their question, as seen in this melody, where the concluding motif of the question is brought up the octave in the answer. Another thing to consider is the motivic strength of an arrival point. Essentially, we're just talking about how close the second to last note is to the last note. In this case, the isolated leap in the question phrase, note the big leap, is followed by half step leading to a motion in the answer, notice the small leap, which sounds more conclusive. The further you travel away from the starting key or modality of the phrase, the more questioning it will sound. You don't even have to travel back to the key you started from in the answer phrase. It just needs to sound closer than the question. In this case, the melody starts out in C mixolydian, the question ending in the distant modality of D flat Lydian, whereas the answer concludes in A aeolian, which, although a tick clockwise on the circle of fifths from C mixolydian, is closer to it than D flat Lydian, which is 3 ticks counterclockwise. The level of dissonance and vertical chords can also affect conclusiveness. Consonant triads tend to sound more self-confident, whereas extended vertical harmony can lend inquisition to the end of a phrase. Here, the question employs a crunchy D minor 7-9 chord, whereas the answer uses a pure D minor triad. Different chord tones tend to have differing levels of conclusiveness. A root sounds more conclusive than a third, and a third sounds more conclusive than a seventh. In this melody, the question phrase ends on the dreamily cloudy ninth of a C major chord, whereas the answer lands on its more down-to-earth third. Dynamics can also play a role in differentiating question and answer phrases. In this melody, the question phrase is instructed to be played softly, whereas its answer begins pulsating and finally reaches mezzo forte in its conclusion, making it sound more conclusive. Gentle articulations like legato and tenuto tend to sound less conclusive than more forceful articulations like marcato. The more richly a phrase is orchestrated, the more conclusive it tends to sound. The first phrase of this melody is played by three flutes in their lower register, a very relaxed sound. The answer phrase puts the melody up an octave in the flutes and doubles it with oboe, celeste, and first violins in octaves. The second flute line also pops up the octave and is doubled by English horn and the lower second violins and violas. The third flute, you guessed it, goes up the octave and is doubled by clarinet in the lower second violins and violas. A bass line is added for depth with legato bass clarinet and contrabassoon doubled by pizzicato cellos and contrabasses. Finally, brass are added towards the end to seal the deal, and some color percussion for drama. Next is homogeneity. This is a broad term that can apply to any factor making a set of instruments sound more or less unified. In the case of this melody, the question phrase has the oboe and bassoon playing different articulations, whereas the answer has the matching articulation. Additionally, the bassoon isn't around to solidify the final note of the question phrase, whereas it is for the answer. Finally, timbre. Instruments whose overtones resemble the purity of a sine wave, like an alto flute, tend to sound milder, whereas those who are closer to a saw, like an oboe, tend to sound more intense and thus more conclusive. The clarinet is an interesting case as it only has every other overtone, but that's a story for another time. Before moving on, it's important to note that one doesn't have to follow each column of this chart all of the time. It's just meant to get you thinking about the psychological effect different musical devices have. Many effective answer phrases have been written that are quiet, and many effective question phrases rise higher in range than their answers. This chart merely notes what most commonly happens in music, and the composer should always be musically sensitive to what's in front of them, so they can combine the right constituents in just the right way for that particular melody rather than consciously applying a set of dogmatic criteria in every circumstance. As we've seen with these little ditties, most tunes tend to involve a relatively parallel relationship between the question-answer phrases. Although some more complex, yet still memorable melodies contrast the two to a greater degree than others with success. They almost always start the same way. Now let's take a break from the vacuum-sealed laboratory conditions and analyze a real tune from Villa-Lobos's Guitar Concerto. This particular melody uses sentence structure. Sentence structure involves three components: a short question, its repetition, often varied slightly as it is here, and a long answer ending in some sort of cadence. Repeating the question is the key component of sentence structure. It helps solidify the motif in the listener's memory. in addition to building up inquisitive tension that makes the answer more satisfying and climactic. Additionally, answer phrases often use motivic material from the question phrases to relate them to what came before. Think about it. If someone asks a verbal question in real life, we wouldn't provide them with an answer that is completely unrelated to their question. In fact, we would often incorporate their question in our answer for clarity. For example, why are you going to the store? I'm going to the store to buy milk, eggs, and fabric softener. Another interesting commonality of catchy tunes is that reductive analysis often reveals a greater degree of meta-repetition that might not be apparent on the decorated surface structure. For example, if in this tune we reduce repeated notes to single note values, we see that the first 3/4 of the melody is really just a descending diatonic sequence. This type of substructure repetition contributes hugely to what makes this get so easily stuck in your head, whereas the surface structure variation keeps it interesting and not completely predictable. For more examples of melodies following sentence structure, I would highly recommend Leonard Bernstein's What is Melody from his Young People's concerts. One last thing about this melody. In the actual concerto, after Villa-Lobos presents the melody in its essential form, its returning iterations often extend the answer sequence upward an extra octave for variety and drama. Another very common melodic form is periodic structure. Periodic structure is much like sentence structure, but more symmetrical. It consists of one question and one answer of equal length. It's important to note that while many small-scale melodies, such as the Villa-Lobos tune, can exist in one sentence comprised of 3 sub-phrases, these 3 phrases can combine to become a new single entity, which functions as a single phrase in a larger scale to phrase periodic structure. That sounds complicated, I know, but it's actually pretty intuitive. Let's see it in action in a melody I'm sure you will recognize. Examining the first sentence, we see that this 3-note motif is repeated twice, with the third iteration introducing new material that leads us to a cadence. The repetition of this motif solidifies the catchiness, but also makes the violation of the repetition more impactful by setting it up in 3 iterations as opposed to only 2. Although the continuation of the third phrase seems unrelated to the original motif, it contains an inverted development of it, with the latter 2 notes expanded to accommodate a change in harmony, followed by its own quasi-inversion that rests back on itself for closure with regard to the harmony. It's the repetition of the note B with a function change that gives the melody its effect, switching from the brightly dissonant Lydian fourth of F major to the more relaxed major seventh of C major. This involves the idea of relative dissonance, where greater dissonance can resolve with emotional effect to lesser dissonance. As in this case, considering the voicing in the accompaniment, which the B is a tritone against the F, a major second, against the A, and A major seventh against the C when the harmony changes to C major. It's also a major seventh against the C, but a constant major third with the G, and a perfect fifth with the E in the bass. So relatively speaking, although the major seventh extension is still technically a dissonance, it's consonant compared to a Lydian fourth, especially since the first inversion makes a B a perfect fifth with the bass. I'm getting ahead of myself. Essentially, this gives the sentence's continuation phrase a sense of positive emotional development. It's important to realize that the third phrase could also be more dissonant than the first 2, but what matters is the fact of the change itself. Change implies emotional development. Stagnation is to be avoided, Otherwise, the melody feels pointless and lacking in a clear trajectory. If we reveal the melody's continuation, we find that these two sentences combine together to form a period. Let's refer back to our question and answer chart to see what makes the second sentence more conclusive than the first. As it turns out, the answer phrase of the consequent sentence is higher, on a more consonant chord function, and its last note is approached by step as opposed to leap. Another less common but completely viable structure is ABBA structure. Check out this delightful little tune of Schubert. Interestingly, with ABBA structure, the outer phrases are conclusive and the inner phrases are inconclusive. We can see this very clearly in this tune with the tonic-dominant-dominant-tonic structure of the harmony. Sometimes for greater variety, the last A can be a C that's unrelated to the first three phrases. One of my favorite examples of this is this sublime tune from Lutosławski's Piano Sonata. And one final example of ABBC structure from one of my own compositions. Now that we've covered broader formal structure, let's get into the note-by-note nitty-gritty and talk about motivic development. You may have heard music theorists use the word development before. For example, Beethoven was a master at developing his material. Development simply means repetition with variation. Exact repetition, as I said before, quickly gets annoying and feels emotionally stagnant, whereas constantly introducing new material leaves the audience with nothing to grasp onto. Think of it like a great novel. We don't want to read about a character doing the same thing over and over again, and we also don't want each chapter to introduce a new character while abandoning the previous one. Rather, a great novel introduces a limited number of characters in a reasonable pace, not exceeding the reader's capacity to remember and become emotionally involved with them, and then constantly places those familiar characters in new situations where they interact with their environment and each other, so that we get to know them more deeply and see not only what they're capable of, but how they continually grow in maturity and power, or denigrate into depravity and weakness. In any case, motivic development is the same thing. Think of motives as characters. Listen to how the colored motives in pure imagination are developed across the span of the tune and its B section. And check out this gorgeous melody from John Williams' score to Memoirs of a Geisha. The entire melody is constructed out of the purple-colored motif. Each time it repeats, it's diatonically transposed to a different scale degree, keeping it fresh and lending an emotional progression. In Yoda's theme, the melody repeats in exactitude 4 times, but each time Williams varies the texture First, it's placed in the cellos. Then in the violins. Then in a flute solo. And finally returning it back to the cellos to round it off. In this way, the tune cements itself without boring us. This technique is one of my personal favorites. If your tune is more than one motif, you can switch up the alternation pattern to keep your listeners on their toes. In this melody, from Richard Rodney Bennett's Partita for Orchestra, in the first phrase we have a B-A-B, whereas in the second phrase we have A-A-B-B. Sometimes a melody, in and of itself, can be successfully extremely repetitive, if there is always a counterline to keep the momentum going. One of my favorite examples of this is Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F, first movement, where literally one note is repeated over and over, but the churning counterline and harmonic accompaniment propels it forward and out of stagnation. One last thing. One might think writing a melody in a widely used musical structure makes it sound inherently cliché. However, the form exists at the meta level and is perceived only subconsciously. Thus, it doesn't deprive a melody from its originality, especially if the composer takes creative license with the proportions. Take the hauntingly beautiful tune from Barber's Piano Concerto, second movement, as an example. The melody starts off with what seems like the two question phrases of a sentence, except that each question is 3 bars long instead of the usual 2. The answer is still 4, but instead of cadencing as usual, it leads into a new C phrase, which repeats with slight embellishment as if creating a new sentence, followed by its own conclusion that is a development of the first question phrase. This is an intricate structure, but the important point here is that it still contains the repetition and symmetry of sentence and periodic structure without following its usual number of bars or phrases exactly. Thus, Barber eschews the cookie cutter while still maintaining coherence of shape and form, while cutting the cookies by hand, so to speak. And that's it for this video. Now that we have a fundamental understanding of originality, emotional impact, and catchiness, We have all the tools at our disposal to compose fresh tunes that stick in people's heads and affect them deeply. Thanks for watching.